The state has a budget, and another allegation of harassment surfaces at the State House. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register, and boy, it was a kind of amazing week at the State House because dysfunction, well, there was a little here and there, but on the whole big budget thing, it didn't happen, and we're going to talk about that with Kent Redfield is back, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, University of Illinois Springfield. Kent, welcome.
Good to be here.
And Dusty Rhodes is back, education reporter for NPR Illinois. Welcome
back,
Bernie. Dusty.
Thanks.
So, Kent, you're the kind of the numbers guy, the budget expert. So, I have to do a mea culpa here. I have said on shows like this, I thought the governor and the legislature would not come to an easy conclusion this year, but boy, there were working groups, House and Senate budgeteers, the members in each caucus, Democratic and Republican, House and Senate, who got together for weeks, crafted a budget. Governor's office apparently involved, depends. Republicans say was more involved than Democrats say, but involved and okay with it, spending the money from the tax increase that was passed last year, $38.5 billion budget, passed a day before the deadline by the Senate and the day of the supposed end of the legislative session this year, May 31st, by the House. And the governor says he will enact it, which we assume means he'll sign it. What do you think of all this?
Well, it's certainly better than what we've done 2 years ago and 3 years ago. I mean, in terms of having a budget. You know, we actually have a budget. Last year was very difficult because we did some really significant things. We raised taxes, we changed the school aid formula, we did some things that are going to have long-term impact on the state's fiscal situation and how we're dealing with public policy. This time around, we didn't do any great things. We didn't, there was no risk-taking, there was no major changing of the course of state government. We kind of lined up how much money we have after the tax increase with how much we're going to spend next year. And you don't hear a lot of cheering from the bond rating agencies because we really didn't address how are we going to, over time, pay down the unpaid bills in a responsible way.
Which is still about, well, it's like $6 billion plus the borrowed money to pay another six.
It depends on how you count.
Right.
And we still have the pension situation, and we've still got a state budget that our revenue sources are a very narrow sales tax and a flat income tax. And so all of the things that if we're going to say let's really change things in Illinois finance the way that we're at least thinking we're going to change things in Illinois education, we really didn't get to those topics. But it's certainly vastly preferable to get out of town.
And just before, what made it so easy, really, to get this done was the fact that over the governor's veto last year and with some Republican support who broke ranks with their own party and their governor, they passed the tax increase last year, so the individual tax rate went from 3.75 to 4.95, and that plus the business side of that, or the corporation side of that, raises, about $5 billion a year, and without that $5 billion, this would not be possible for everybody to agree on how to spend what you've got, because you would have so much less.
Absolutely.
Okay. Dusty, education, of course, the formula was passed last year. Schools finally this year got some of the money. How do they come out in the budget? K through 12 first, I guess.
They got, actually what they got is $300 million, not the $350 million. In new money, above their base funding minimum. So that's the part that goes to equity, goes to trying to bring up the districts that have been underfunded, by, as much as 60%. The reason you'll hear $350 million, but $50 million of that goes this year into property tax relief fund to kind of incentivize some of the districts that have had high property taxes to lower that. And there was a long committee meeting, a 2-hour committee meeting that was the focus of the argument, was can you give us another 50 million? Now, this time there was an extra 50 million for early childhood, but that's younger than K-12.
Right, okay, so this will allow, politically speaking, which we do a little bit on the show just to kind of analyze, the governor will say we gave more money to education and we're becoming more equitable, and the legislators can say the same thing. So giving at least some more accomplishes that. Higher education, during the 2-year budget impasse that happened early in the Rauner administration with the Republican governor, the Democratic legislature, higher education really took it as hard as any group of agencies because there was no budget passed or approved by the governor for higher education for a couple years, other than some stopgap funding. We lost a lot of teachers, a lot who've gone other places. A lot of students have decided to go other places, and so there was a lot of talk this year. What can we do for the universities to incentivize, to help that with the grants and something about helping with tuition? But also, I think it's a 2% increase
Right.
that was put in the budget for universities, at least over what they were getting. So, Dusty, how do universities come out of this? Obviously, that we're still not quite there.
It's 2% over the 2018 level, which I'm reading this precisely, was a 10% cut from the 2015 level.
Right. Okay.
So you
they're
do
still,
that math.
they're still getting less than they got 3 years ago.
Yeah, and then the rest of all these, what really helped higher education this time was a working group, a bipartisan, bicameral working group that Senator Pat McGuire put together, kind of at the suggestion of Tom Cross, but he did it, McGuire did it his way. And I noticed a change in the higher ed committee, the Senate higher ed committee, room. You would see more, there's Democrats on this side, Republicans on this side. You kept seeing them going across talking to each other a lot more. That group of people is super enthusiastic about what they're doing. They're kind of mirroring that K-12 bipartisan, bicameral group. And they have a package of bills that's different. Like the K-12 group never came out with a bill, if you recall. Andy Menard criticized him for that a lot. This group has come out with a package of bills, and some of them are short-term and some of them are long-term. They didn't get them all done this time, but
they're trying to keep students in Illinois because we've really been
they plan to continue
losing them to other states.
Oh, yeah.
Like tens of thousands.
We were the second highest for out-migration of college students before the budget impasse. So,
In general, Kent, on the whole budget thing this year, do you see the fact that the budget came together so easily and the governor went on? Is this the legislature basically saying we are an equal partner in government, listen to us this year, and that the governor had to go along? Or is it politically that necessity for the governor, too, not to look like he can't get a deal done when he's now in his election year and taking on Democrat J.B. Pritzker?
It was in no one's best interest to have a fight and to drag this out into August, and are we going to open schools? And so, the governor and the legislature, the state is functioning. We got a budget. We got out of town. We passed a bunch of bills. We look kind of, normal, whatever normal is in terms of your expectations for a legislature compared to the train wreck we've had over the last 2 years.
Which is interesting because even in past years, they've almost never been out of town exactly on time without having to stay overtime for something, and they really did get out by the May 31st deadline before the requirement for passage goes up to an extraordinary majority instead of just a majority to pass a bill that's immediately effective, or in the new fiscal year that starts July 1st.
Yeah, because they had enough money to get through this fiscal year with a little bit of nip and tuck, and local governments are only getting 5% less than they should get under the local government distributive fund
from the sales tax,
as opposed to 10% less last year.
Right.
We're doing a little bit less for the administrative costs for the sales tax, which affects local governments, is a little bit less this time around.
Yeah.
And so, it was, everybody can say, wow, we can cooperate, we can cut deals, and nobody really wants to talk about, are there some really, really serious things that we need to do to address, because that long term, because that would require, having a fight about how we fund state government, how we tax the citizens of Illinois, and there was no appetite to engage in those long-term questions.
I think on those not public TV stations, shortly we're going to start seeing that fight play out as the governor's race heats up with two very well-off candidates, and J.B. Pritzker, the Democrat, says we should have a progressive income tax, which would take a constitutional amendment, and people with high incomes would pay more. And he would argue that people with middle and low incomes pay less. And the governor will say, no, if you raise taxes, job creators will stay out of Illinois. And other states that have done this, he's probably right in some cases, it ends up taxing everybody more. So that's going to be a big fight. We'll see where it goes. Dusty, last time we were on this show together, you had brought up the kind of battle between the campuses of Southern Illinois, Carbondale and Edwardsville, and there was even thought of, would those campuses break up as Edwardsville has gained more students and Carbondale has lost. They ended up, I think the Board of Trustees actually met and decided, we're not going to break up, but how did that fight come out of the legislative session?
Well, the breakup is on hold. Like I wrote in a headline that the judge has sent the divorcing couple to mediation, and they're trying to decide whether to stay together for the good of the kids, and so and the Board of Higher Education has also taken on the task of doing an impartial study of how those finances, the allocation, should shake out. So Terry Bryant last night, the
state representative from Murfreesboro, Southern Illinois.
Republican. Mm-hmm. I talked to her on the way out of the chamber, and I think that the mood of that chamber being released makes people speak more freely. And she said that the rancor went back to the selection of the Carbondale chancellor, the new Carbondale chancellor. And I think you probably remember that there were news stories about job for a relative
of the new chancellor down there,
right? And some moving expenses, and that was kind of the genesis of this little fight. So we'll see how it plays out.
And if the SIU camp system stays together, which Springfield has some interest in, partly because there's been talk of at least a law school, maybe the third year coming, getting a campus in Springfield. Plus SIU is the oversight board for the School of Medicine, which is in Springfield.
Oh, Springfield has a stake in this, and certainly, their part of higher education has to do with demographics and where are the students and what's happening to the economy on a regional basis. And so there's been a lot of pressure on downstate public universities because of the changes in the demographics. All of the growth is in the suburbs, and so that pressure is certainly there. Historically, we used to have a system of systems, and we put all of the various universities under three boards, with the exception of Carbondale, of SIU, and the University of Illinois. So there's there's a group within higher education that says we could be more efficient and effective if we look like California or Wisconsin, just roll everything
into
one giant board. But there's always the pull, like we're seeing with Edwardsville, about we don't get our share unless we've got our own board and can go and do our own lobbying. So it will be, this is, Carbondale and Edwardsville is kind of the latest, the most visible, latest iteration of what's going to be a struggle for kind of how do we organize higher education and how do we allocate resources.
Which is interesting because our Governor Rauner, has talked a lot about how there's too many administrators in higher ed, and maybe there's too many programs that copy each other on different campuses, and maybe we should streamline, which again talks about, well, do you really want someone in Western Illinois to have to go to Northern Illinois University if they want to study a certain thing? On the other hand, and his first budget, proposal in his first year in 2015 had like a 30% cut to universities, and yet he goes to universities and says they are the economic engine, we want to do more, and there's also a new kind of high-tech campus in Chicago that he's got in this budget $500 million for, with University of Illinois as the lead agency to kind of develop, more knowledge, and that's the economic engine of the future. So a lot of conflicting messages and not enough money always to get it done. So we'll see where it goes. We should, the Me Too movement and things like that came to the State House again this week, where there was someone named Marianne Longcar, who had been an advocate for legislation. She lives in Plainfield now, an advocate for legislation for medical marijuana over the last several years. Said she worked with Lou Lang, who's been a Democratic leader in the House. He's from Skokie. He was the chief sponsor of that bill over a number of years. It finally got done. She had a press conference. She appeared with Denise Rothheimer, who's another person who had alleged that a legislator treated her wrongly. Denise Rothheimer is the person who said Ira Silverstein, a state senator, sent her hundreds of inappropriate messages, kind of flirtatious. They were going back and forth, actually, according to some, according to the way they look. And Ira Silverstein ended up being found to have acted inappropriately, but not sexual harassment, by the legislative inspector general. He lost a primary. He'll be leaving the legislature. Lou Lang says, Marianne Longcar said that Lou Lang did some inappropriate things, touched her low on the back one time, said to her, and this was an hour-long press conference this week, said to her, does your husband know how lucky he is? Inappropriate comment like that. And she then says, that he made certain comments like yelling or being threatening in some ways because the legislation didn't go the way she wanted. It only came out in the middle of that hour-long press conference that she had a not-for-profit company that wanted to grow and produce marijuana, and the way the legislation was written for-profit companies, which Lang said Republicans wanted. It cut her out, so Lang says she just didn't get what she wanted. It's sour grapes. But he also quit his leadership position, stepped off the ethics board, and then had a press conference with several colleagues around him, including women legislators he works with, saying he's a mentor, he's a good guy. And Lou Lang saying basically, this woman complaining about me, these are wrong, the thing she says, it didn't happen. And I called for an investigation, and the woman said, I don't want the Inspector General to investigate. She, despite the fact she felt threatened in the past by something Lang said to her husband, she never went to police, she never went to the Inspector General. She said she doesn't trust any of those people. So what do we got here? Dusty, analyze it immediately. What do we got?
Oh, wow. Well, I think one thing that needs to be brought up is that the women who came out with Lang and also Jeannie Ives. You forgot to mention Jeannie Ives.
Conservative Republican House member Jeannie Ives appeared at the news conference with Marianne Longcar, and so basically said, the system here is bad, and so she easily takes on Madigan.
None of the women spoke to Ms. Longcar's specific allegations. Right. They all. In fact, they all took a great care to point out that they were not addressing her experience. They were speaking of their own experience. Representative Ives specifically was focused on the system, the process.
We need a better process where
the process,
legislative leaders are not judging themselves in cases like this, so that women can feel free, or whoever feels aggrieved can come forward with a complaint.
Right. She doesn't trust the process, and there was a moment where so Ms. Longcar had been speaking about. She kept referring to warehouses full of cash, and at one point she talked about how well known she was in the State House and how the Illinois State Police know her very well, the Illinois State Police in the State House, and those are not Illinois State Police. The only ISP guys in the State House are the Executive Protection Unit for the governor, and they're the guys. Those are secretaries.
Let's just say she was.
And at that moment, Representative Ives said, "Okay, I have to go back to the floor for a vote, and this press conference may continue, but I'm stepping out." And it just I think everyone agrees she raised some things that need to be investigated, and actually have been investigated by a couple of other journalists, by Better Government Association and Chicago Tribune. But we'll see.
Yeah, there are clearly shades of gray here, and it's interesting. I mean, she talked about she saw something happen that was terrible, and then when pressed, she said somebody tried to bribe Lou Lang and other people. And the stories that I read the day after show that what really happened is there was a medical marijuana manufacturer or grower that was offering to buy all the licenses for $168 million, and Lou Lang and everybody in the room said no, that's not going to happen. But she was interpreting that as like a bribe offered and rejected. But that seems to be not a correct statement, at least not a correct characterization. So this again, and there were questions to her. Politics is tough, and as Lou Lang said, some people win, some people lose, they get unhappy, and that's just what happened here.
Brian Mackey, my colleague Brian Mackey, said something like, sometimes people come into this environment and they see the sausage making and they're overwhelmed by the sausage making. It can be shocking.
So we really, I think Lou Lang said that he was stepping down from some of these positions just to not be a distraction, not get in the way. On the other hand, I don't think it's very clear at all what long-term ramifications there are if it was appropriate. And clearly, to have the press conference that Ms. Longcar had for an hour and to keep there and answering questions and raising more questions as you answer questions, I'm not sure it helped her case.
No, I don't think it was not well handled. She had been on a radio show with a leading conservative voice. And
Dan Proft in Chicago that morning, which seems to put, it's certainly you can think there's a political tilt if somebody's going to Dan Proft first.
And so we've conflated a whole bunch of things together here.
Yeah.
And, the essence of sexual harassment and sexual assault is about people in power using their power to harm women. And she was making some allocations about Lang's behavior towards her, which she interpreted as inappropriate. Now that's, you have to, we need to take those things seriously. But when you conflate all of that with what's the normal rough and tumble of the legislative process, it becomes very difficult to sort all of those things out. It is also complicated by the fact that if you have criminal, if someone, engages in sexual assault, that's a criminal issue. That's outside the legislature.
Right. And even the things she said, other than comments over the phone to her ex-husband, which apparently in one situation he said he didn't hear from Lang, so I don't know. But there was nothing quite like that other than a hand on the back, and she, in front of the press conference, kind of showed where on the back this was.
And in that case, you're left with the legislature. The only way you can remove a person, the only way you can expel a member of the General Assembly is for the legislature to do that. It's a separation of powers issue, and so if you try to set up this legislative inspector general process, apparently we got makes that a little bit better. But ultimately, if we're not into legal issues, if we're into ethical, moral, what's appropriate behavior, the legislature really is judging itself, because ultimately, if you're going to take actions against a member, the only group that can do that is the legislature.
One interesting side note, which brings in another giant issue of last week from a certain perspective, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a giant issue when I was down here my first year full-time for the Bloomington paper in 1982, 36 years ago. It never passed both the Senate and the House in the same year. Ratification of the Federal Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed, I guess, by Congress in 1972, or at least the latest iteration. The deadline was supposed to be 82 after it was extended. Now there's this theory that if a couple other states, Illinois became the 37th, and if another state passes it, a court might decide that it does belong in the Constitution. We will find out. And that's just that, basically saying, you can't discriminate against women or based on sex. But the House sponsor of that bill in the long House discussion was Lou Lang, saying, women should be equal, and he was passionate about it, and then the next day this happens to him. But that got 72 votes. It needed 71. Several Republicans voted for it. So that we move on with that and see where that goes. Speaking of older issues, Rod Blagojevich. Rod Blagojevich, of course, the Democratic governor who was sent away to prison for 14 years after being listened to, surreptitiously by the FBI on wiretaps, and also having other people say that he was shaking them down for campaign contributions before allowing state funding to go their way, but famously talking about what he could get for naming someone to Barack Obama's U.S. Senate seat when Obama was named president. President Trump said this week that he's seriously considering commuting Blagojevich's sentence. Rod Blagojevich has been in a Colorado prison now for 6 years. He's supposed to be there, I think, till 2024. His wife, Patty, has been in close communication. One of his daughters is going to graduate college shortly. Patty Blagojevich has been on Fox News, said to be President Trump's favorite venue to kind of pick up on things. So it's possible, I guess, that even by the time the show airs, that the president will act on Rod Blagojevich, and there's certainly mixed emotions about that around here. Dusty, your thoughts?
Well, I wanted to watch Patty on Fox last night, so I Googled, and the funny thing was the second hit was Patty on Fox from May 8th, and in that show, Laura Ingraham, the host, specifically asked her if you could tell President Trump one thing other than pardon your husband or commute his sentence, what would you tell him about Bob Mueller? So it's not hard to see, how this gets started. And then the rest of the show is devoted to, or maybe it was I'm confused, but a chunk of the show is devoted to explaining the connection between Bob Mueller, James Comey, and Patrick Fitzgerald,
who was the prosecutor that put Blagojevich away. And of course, President Trump has been on a tear saying the FBI is unfair. And Rod Blagojevich recently had a Wall Street Journal editorial that he was able to get printed from prison, saying how unfair everybody was to him. Now, prosecutors and people who watch in Illinois say, hey, Rod Blagojevich is really papering over all the bad things he did, like saying he wouldn't give money to Children's Memorial Hospital unless he got hundreds of thousands of dollars, or tens of thousands of dollars from the guy running it. But things like that may go away in the wash, and we'll see if 6 years turns out to be enough. Have to end it there. Kent Redfield and Dusty Rhodes, thanks for your conversation and thoughts. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.